Imagine spending your entire life changing the way humanity understands nature. You develop the theory of evolution, you write one of the most important scientific books ever published, you become one of the most famous naturalists in history, and then, for the final book you'll ever write, you choose to focus on worms. Not lions, not elephants, not exotic creatures from distant lands, earthworms, the ones living beneath our feet every single day. When I first came across this story, I found it fascinating. After all, Charles Darwin spent decades studying some of the biggest questions in science, yet towards the end of his life, he became obsessed with one of the smallest and most overlooked creatures in the garden. And the more I learned about it, the more I began to think he may have been right. Because if there's one thing I've come to appreciate after more than 40 years of growing organically, it's this. The real work in a garden isn't happening above the soil, it's happening underneath it. For most of human history, earthworms weren't particularly respected. In fact, many people viewed them as pests. Farmers often assumed they were damaging crops, eating roots, or somehow interfering with the soil. If they saw worms while cultivating the ground, they thought little of killing them. The idea that these soft-bodied creatures might actually be helping create fertile soil seemed unlikely. Yet Darwin wasn't convinced. As a young man, he had read the observations of earlier naturalists who suggested worms might be doing more good than harm. The idea stayed with him. And over the years, while carrying out his famous work on evolution and natural selection, he kept returning to the same question. What exactly are worms doing beneath our feet? Most people would have dismissed it as a trivial subject. Darwin didn't. He spent decades observing them. He kept worms for study. He watched how they fed. He examined how they reacted to light and vibration. He measured how much soil they moved. He looked at how they pulled leaves into their burrows. He became fascinated by their behavior. What began as curiosity gradually became something much bigger. The more he observed, the more he realized these creatures were quietly reshaping the land itself. In 1881, just 1 year before his death, Darwin published his final book. It was called The Formation of Vegetable Mold Through the Action of Worms. Not exactly a title that sounds like a bestseller, yet it became enormously popular. The book contained a remarkable argument. Darwin suggested that earthworms were among the most important animals on the planet. He argued that they were constantly creating and maintaining the fertile topsoil upon which agriculture depends. At the time, many people thought this was an exaggeration. How could a simple worm be so important? But Darwin had spent decades gathering evidence. He observed that worms were constantly pulling organic matter into the soil. They were mixing plant material with mineral particles. They were creating channels underground. They were processing huge amounts of material year after year, slowly, quietly, patiently, exactly the way nature often works. And over the following century, science began confirming what Darwin had suspected. Today we know that earthworms are far more than simple creatures living in the soil. They are ecosystem engineers. Every time a worm moves through the ground, it creates pathways for air and water. Every time it feeds, it helps break down organic matter. Every casting it leaves behind contains nutrients and beneficial microorganisms. Those castings become part of the fertility cycle that supports plant growth. The tunnels they create allow rainwater to move deeper into the soil. Plant roots often follow those same pathways. The result is better drainage, better structure, and healthier growing conditions. What fascinates me is that worms don't do any of this because they're trying to improve our gardens. They're simply living their lives. The improvements are a side effect. Nature doesn't work from a master plan. It works through countless small actions repeated over and over again. And that's exactly what worms do. Over the past few years, I've found myself paying much more attention to what happens on the soil surface, partly because of age, partly because of the changing climate, and partly because I've been learning from growers in other parts of the world. One thing that really stood out to me when watching Korean and Japanese growers was how little bare soil they seemed to have. Leaves were left on the ground. Plant residues stayed where they fell. Organic matter was constantly being returned to the soil. Nothing appeared wasted. At first glance, it almost looked untidy compared with what many gardeners are used to. But when you looked more closely, there was a logic behind it. The soil was protected, moisture was retained, and life below the surface was being fed continuously. The more I thought about it, the more it reminded me of Darwin's observations. Because worms need food, they need moisture, they need shelter, and a layer of organic material provides all three. In my own garden, I've noticed the difference. Where soil remains covered, it tends to stay cooler during summer heat. It retains moisture for longer, and when you pull back the mulch, you often find far more biological activity underneath. Not just worms, beetles, fungi, Countless organisms working away unseen. When the soil is bare, especially during periods of extreme heat, conditions become much harsher. The surface dries quickly, temperatures rise, life retreats deeper underground. That doesn't mean every garden must look the same, but it does suggest that nature prefers covered soil, and perhaps we should pay attention to that. One of the biggest lessons I've learned over the years is that gardening becomes easier when we work with natural processes instead of constantly fighting them. Many of us were taught that bare soil was a sign of good gardening. We were encouraged to clear everything away, dig regularly, keep beds neat and tidy. Yet when you walk through a woodland, nature does almost the opposite. Leaves fall, organic matter accumulates, the soil remains covered, and beneath that cover, an extraordinary amount of life develops. The woodland floor becomes a giant composting system. Everything is recycled. Everything has a purpose. The worms are part of that process. So are fungi. So are bacteria. Together they create fertility without anyone adding bags of fertilizer. Now, I'm not suggesting that we abandon all cultivation or stop managing our gardens, but I do think there's value in asking a simple question. How can we make life easier for the organisms that are already trying to help us? The answer is often surprisingly simple. Keep the soil covered. Add organic matter whenever possible. Compost, leaves, grass clippings, plant residues. Avoid disturbing the soil unnecessarily. Keep living roots in the ground for more of the year. Grow cover crops when beds would otherwise sit empty. These aren't revolutionary ideas. In many ways, they're very old ideas, but they're also remarkably effective. The older I get, the more interested I become in systems that require less effort. Not because I want to stop gardening, quite the opposite. I want to keep gardening for as long as possible. That means finding approaches that work with nature instead of demanding constant intervention. It's one reason I've become increasingly interested in mulching. It's one reason I've been questioning some long-held assumptions about weeds. And it's one reason Darwin's final book resonates with me so strongly, because at its heart, his message was surprisingly simple. The creatures we overlook are often doing some of the most important work. Darwin spent 40 years studying earthworms. 40 years. That's how long I have been growing. Not because they were exciting or because they were fashionable, but because he suspected they mattered. History has largely proven him right. Today, whenever I see worms in the garden, I view them differently. They're not just inhabitants of the soil, they're partners. Quiet workers helping build fertility, improve structure, and support the countless biological processes that healthy gardens depend upon. Most of us spend our time looking at what grows above the ground, the tomatoes, the beans, the onions, the harvest. But perhaps the real secret lies beneath our feet, because when the soil is alive, everything else becomes easier. And that may be the most important gardening lesson Charles Darwin ever left us. Perhaps the real secret lies beneath our feet, because when the soil is alive, everything else becomes easier. And that's become increasingly important to me. As I've got older, I've found myself looking for ways to reduce effort without reducing results. Not gardening less, gardening more intelligently. In our next video, I'll be talking about one of the biggest changes I've made in my own garden over recent years, covering the soil with mulch. It's a simple idea, but after watching growers in Korea and Japan and seeing the results in my own beds, I've come to believe it might be one of the most important techniques for gardeners who want healthier soil, fewer weeds, less watering, and less physical work. I'll share what I've learned, what's worked, what hasn't, and why I think it has become even more important as I get older. Until then, take care, and I'll see you in the next entry of the diary.